This week brings our journey from the Civil War into Reconstruction and the literary turn to realism. As we move through the unit, our goal is to notice how writers shift from idealized stories to grounded portrayals of everyday life, social change, and national uncertainty. As you engage the readings and lecture, watch for what feels ordinary on the surface but carries larger questions underneath. Pay attention to the setting, social class, and the pressures shaping characters' choices. By the end of the week, you should be able to describe key features of realism and explain why this style emerged when it did. Let's get started. In this session, we will examine Whitman, James, and Howells through insights drawn from three scholarly articles, focusing on how literature depicts war, social expectations, and individual choice. Before we start, a brief disclaimer. The purpose of this class is not to promote a particular narrative or tell you what to believe. The aim is to present historical and literary information, introduce multiple scholarly perspectives, and help you practice evidence based analysis so you can think critically and develop your own conclusions. Since this is an asynchronous lecture, you won't be responding in real time, but you are still expected to engage actively. As you listen, pause when needed and take notes on claims, key terms, and examples. Treat the guiding questions as prompts you can answer in writing for your discussion post, reading notes, or short analytical assignments. As you go through the lecture, focus on three key things. First, what historical or cultural pressures influence the characters or speakers? Second, what choices does the text present as available or restricted? Third, what details in the text support more than one interpretation? Your goal is to leave this lecture with specific evidence you can use to form a clear claim in your papers and discussion questions. These guiding questions are here to help you organize your thinking across the text and to give you ready-made prompts for your discussion posts and short papers. As you work through the readings, do not try to answer all four at once. Choose one or two and track specific textual evidence that helps you respond in a focused way. Notice what each writer emphasizes and how the text shapes your response, rather through tone, imagery, narration, or plot outcomes. Also note where more than one interpretation is possible and be prepared to explain why you think your reading is the strongest based on the details in the text. Here's our roadmap for the lecture. We will move through three scholarly readings one at a time and then pull them together in a brief synthesis. First, we look at Whitman's Drum Taps and questions about how war poetry can shape public memory and moral response. Next, we'll examine Daisy Miller as a case study in cultural conflict and what happens when social expectations collide without compromise. Third, we'll turn to Editha and focus on agency, especially how language and social pressure shape what a character can claim or resist. At the end, we will connect the text across shared themes and return to a few classroom prompts you can use directly in your discussion posts and papers. So, first, we're looking at Whitman as a war poet, but not in the way you might expect. The main idea here is that his poetry can actually feel a little uncomfortable. Critics consider his poetry problematic because it sometimes celebrates war more than it questions it. Pause here and make note of the article's three main issues. Now, this is where things get interesting. Whitman describes war with energy, almost like it's exciting or heroic. But the problem is, it can cross into something called jingoism. That's when patriotism becomes expressive, like hype without reflection. One critique of Whitman is that he writes like an observer. He's showing us war, but not always making us feel it deeply. And that raises a question: can you fully represent something you didn't directly experience? As you work through the poems, look for where Whitman's voice feels like a witness, where it feels intimate, and where the poem's stance creates either distance or closeness. Now we shift from war to social rules with Henry James's Daisy Miller and one scholar's explanation for why mediation fails in the story. The story is really about what happens when two cultures clash and nobody is willing to compromise. You've got Daisy representing American freedom, Winterbourne trying to mediate, and European society enforcing strict rules. Take a moment to look at how each role functions. Next, let's zoom in on how the article interprets Daisy's behavior as she moves through European social spaces. The main point is that Daisy keeps familiar American social habits while traveling and resists outside correction. In the scholar's reading, she does not treat European social rules as legitimate authority over her choices, and she often hears advice as interference rather than guidance. The article argues that this refusal to adjust intensifies conflict because it widens the gap between what Daisy thinks her actions mean and what the surrounding community takes them to signal. As a result, social condemnation accelerates. As you read Daisy Miller, pay attention to the difference between intention and perception. What does Daisy say she is doing? What do others assume she is doing? And what textual details support each interpretation? The article further argues that Winterbourne's role as a mediator is shaped by control and deference to social pressure. The main idea is that Winterbourne understands European expectations and tries to manage Daisy into behavior that will be seen as acceptable. In other words, instead of translating cultures in a neutral way, he often translates Daisy into the terms that the European social world will approve. Pause here and make note of why the article claims he ultimately fails. The article also argues that European social custom in Daisy Miller is something that is enforced through judgment rather than negotiated through dialogue. Mrs. Costello and Mrs. Walker are presented as representatives of rigid rulemaking. In the scholar's interpretation, They respond quickly to perceived disobedience and treat improper behavior as a moral failing, not simply a difference in social practice. As you read, pay attention to what forms of power are operating here. Notice how reputation, exclusion, and gossip function as enforcement tools, and consider whether the text leaves room for alternative interpretations of Daisy's actions. Now we move into a different kind of power, agency, in Howell's Editha, and how influence and decision making work inside restrictive gender expectations. The core claim on this slide is that Editha pursues agency primarily through language and persuasion. In this reading, she may not hold formal power, but she shapes what others do by framing choices, appealing to ideals, and pressuring the people around her. As you read, pay attention to what words do in this story. Track how Editha's language reframes duty, honor, and identity, and then trace the consequences that follow from those framed choices. This slide highlights a central tension the article uses to frame Editha's agency. Editha is expected to leave him free, but she also presses George towards war because it fits her ideal of what masculinity, honor, and partnership should look like. The key interpretive move is that language becomes Editha's main way of acting in the world. Because direct power is limited, persuasion becomes the tool she uses to shape outcomes and influence choices. The second point is important for your analysis. In this context, persuasion can be read in two ways at once. It can be agency because it is how Editha asserts influence, and it can be manipulation because it pressures George towards a decision with serious consequences. As you read, look closely at what Editha says, how she says it, and how George responds. Pay attention to where the story signals admiration, critique, or irony, and use those cues to support your interpretation. This slide focuses on what happens after the consequences arrive and how the story manages blame. After George dies, things shift. Editha doesn't just deal with grief, she also deals with blame. But then someone reframes the situation for her, and suddenly she's able to return to her ideal version of reality. The main takeaway is that agency can extend beyond influencing decisions to shaping the narrative a community accepts afterwards. As you read, track how language, social class cues, and labels like vulgar or ideal guide sympathy and interpretation, and decide whether the text presents that narrative control as justified, troubling, or both. Now let's zoom out. All three texts are really asking, how much control do we actually have? The three main ideas are: social pressure limits choice, influence can be ethical or dangerous, power decides what's acceptable. Take a moment to read through the connections. As you engage the text, here are some questions you can use to move from summary to analysis. Treat each one as a prompt for a claim you can defend with specific textual evidence. Pause here and make note of the questions. Finally, the takeaway for our first unit is the turn to realism after the Civil War and 3 practical ways to read post Civil War literature. Realism after 1865 is not just a new style, it is a new way of telling the truth about American life after crisis. It replaces idealized narratives with scenes shaped by social forces, cultural conflict, and the cost of war. As you move into your first discussion and short response, use one of the 3 lenses, the national lens, the cultural lens, or the gendered lens, to make a clear claim. Choose a specific passage as evidence and explain how the passage shows realism departing from romanticism. This concludes this week's lecture. If you have questions, you know you can always reach out, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.